Hey there, welcome back. Before we dive in, take a deep breath and let the stress of the day melt away. I'm really glad you're here, and I'd love to get to know you better. So if you had to choose, what would be your favourite food? Let me know in the comments. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. And enjoy. In the closing years of the 10th century, England stood as a kingdom divided against itself, its Anglo-Saxon rulers struggling beneath the weight of incompetent leadership and relentless Viking pressure. The realm that had once been unified under the great Alfred and his successors now trembled under the rule of Ethelred, a king whose epithet the Unready would echo through history as a testament to royal failure. This monarch, whose reign began in 978, had inherited a crown heavy with the expectations of his predecessors, yet he would prove utterly incapable of meeting the challenges that faced his fractured kingdom. The England of Ethelred's time was a nation perpetually under siege, not merely from external enemies but from its own internal contradictions. The king's response to Viking raids had become increasingly desperate and short-sighted, culminating in the implementation of the Danegeld, a tribute system that saw English silver flow across the North Sea into Danish coffers. This policy, though perhaps intended as a temporary measure to buy peace, had the opposite effect, advertising England's wealth while simultaneously demonstrating its weakness. The Vikings, rather than being deterred, were emboldened by these payments, seeing them as proof that the Anglo-Saxon kingdom was ripe for conquest. The political landscape of early 11th century England was further complicated by deep divisions within the Anglo-Saxon nobility themselves. Decades of Viking settlement in the Danelaw regions had created a complex web of loyalties and identities. Many nobles in these areas had grown accustomed to Scandinavian rule and customs, and some actively favoured the prospect of Danish overlordship over continued submission to an ineffective Anglo-Saxon monarch. This internal division would prove crucial in the events that followed, as the kingdom's inability to present a united front against external threats made it vulnerable to conquest by a determined and capable enemy. Across the North Sea, that enemy was taking shape in the person of Sweyn Forkbeard, King of Denmark. Sweyn was the son of Harold Bluetooth, and unlike the embattled Ethelred, he represented the new generation of Viking leadership that combined traditional Norse martial prowess with sophisticated political strategy. His reign, which began around 986, was marked by ambitious expansion and the gradual construction of what would become the most formidable maritime empire of the medieval period. Sweyn had already established his influence in Norway through a combination of diplomacy and force, and he had formed crucial alliances with Swedish and Norwegian factions that provided him with the resources necessary for large-scale military operations. The Danish king understood that England represented more than just another target for Viking raids. The kingdom's wealth, accumulated through centuries of trade and agricultural development, made it a prize worth conquering rather than merely plundering. Moreover, Sweyn recognised that the political instability and division within England created an opportunity for permanent conquest that might not present itself again. The decades of Viking settlement in the Danelaw had created natural allies within England itself, while Ethelred's unpopular policies had alienated many of his own subjects. The broader context of Viking influence in the British Isles provided the foundation for Sweyn's ambitions. For generations, Scandinavian settlers had established themselves throughout northern and eastern England, creating a complex cultural landscape where Norse and Anglo-Saxon traditions had blended and evolved. These communities maintained connections to their Scandinavian homeland while developing distinctly English characteristics, creating a bridge between the two worlds that ambitious Danish leaders could exploit. The success of earlier Viking raids and the establishment of trading networks had demonstrated that England was both accessible and profitable, while the kingdom's internal divisions suggested that resistance might be overcome through careful planning and execution. When Sweyn finally launched his invasion in 1013, he did so with the accumulated experience of decades of Viking warfare and the resources of a unified Danish kingdom behind him. His forces were drawn not only from Denmark, but also from Norway and even Scotland, representing a truly international coalition of Scandinavian power. The invasion fleet utilised the sophisticated naval technology that had made Viking expansion possible, employing fast-moving ships capable of both sea and river navigation to penetrate deep into English territory with devastating speed and efficiency. The Danish strategy was as much political as it was military. Rather than simply attempting to conquer England through brute force, Sweyn and his advisors recognised the importance of winning local support and exploiting existing divisions within the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. They coordinated their military operations with discontented English nobles, particularly in the Danelaw regions where Danish rule might be seen as a return to familiar governance rather than foreign conquest. This political dimension of the invasion proved crucial to its rapid success, as many English territories submitted without resistance when faced with the choice between fighting a hopeless battle or accepting what appeared to be inevitable Danish victory. The campaign's progression revealed the extent to which English resistance had been weakened by years of internal division and poor leadership. Northumbria and the Danelaw region submitted early to Sweyn's forces, their populations apparently viewing the Danish conquest as preferable to continued rule under Ethelred. Mercia followed suit, and when the Danish forces reached London, the kingdom's most important commercial centre, the writing was on the wall for Anglo-Saxon resistance. The siege and eventual submission of London marked the decisive turning point in the campaign, as control of this crucial city gave Sweyn effective dominance over England's political and economic life. Faced with the collapse of organised resistance and the submission of his most important cities, King Ethelred made the decision that would define his legacy. Rather than attempting to continue the fight from a position of weakness, he fled to Normandy in late 1013, effectively abandoning his throne and his kingdom to the Danish conqueror. This flight represented more than just personal cowardice. It was the final admission that the Anglo-Saxon system of governance had failed to meet the challenges of the age. Ethelred's exile left England without legitimate native leadership and created a power vacuum that Sweyn was quick to fill. On December 25, 1013, Sweyn Forkbeard was formally recognised as King of England by most of the English nobility. This Christmas coronation was rich with symbolism, marking not just a change of dynasty, but the apparent end of Anglo-Saxon independence. The date chosen for this recognition emphasised the religious dimension of medieval kingship, while also demonstrating Sweyn's understanding of English customs and expectations. However, despite this formal recognition, the consolidation of Danish control over England was far from complete, and events would soon prove that the conquest was more fragile than it initially appeared. The sudden death of Sweyn Forkbeard at Gainsborough in February 1014 created a crisis that no one had anticipated. After such a rapid and seemingly decisive conquest, the death of the conqueror after barely 2 months of rule threw the entire political settlement into chaos. Power nominally passed to Sweyn's son Snut, but the young prince lacked his father's established authority and the network of relationships that had made the conquest possible. The Danish hold on England, which had seemed so secure just weeks earlier, suddenly appeared tenuous and uncertain. The English nobility, faced with this unexpected opportunity, moved quickly to reverse the Danish conquest. They sent envoys to Normandy inviting Ethelred to return from exile, though their invitation came with conditions that reflected their dissatisfaction with his previous rule. The nobles demanded reforms that would address the failures of leadership that had made the Danish conquest possible in the first place. This negotiated restoration represented a recognition that while Danish rule might be unacceptable, a simple return to the status quo was equally problematic. Nut, recognising that his position in England had become untenable without his father's authority and facing renewed English resistance, made the strategic decision to withdraw temporarily to Denmark. This retreat was not an admission of defeat, but rather a tactical move designed to allow time for regrouping and the gathering of additional resources. The young Danish prince understood that holding England would require more than the initial conquest. It would demand sustained military pressure and political skill that he had not yet had time to develop. The period following Sweyn's death and Nut's withdrawal was marked by political instability and uncertainty throughout England. The rapid reversal of Danish conquest had demonstrated the fragility of political arrangements based primarily on military force, while the conditional nature of Ethelred's restoration revealed the deep dissatisfaction that existed within English society. Neither the Anglo-Saxon nor the Danish claimants to the English throne possessed unquestioned legitimacy, creating conditions that would inevitably lead to renewed conflict. When Nut returned to England in the summer of 1015, he came with a larger and better equipped force than his father had commanded, but more importantly he brought a refined strategy that had learned from the previous year's experience. Rather than relying solely on military conquest, the young Danish king focused on winning genuine allegiance from English nobles and communities. This approach recognised that lasting control over England would require more than battlefield victories. It would demand the construction of a political coalition that could sustain Danish rule even in the face of Anglo-Saxon resistance. Central to this strategy was Knut's marriage to Elfgifu of Northampton, a powerful noblewoman whose connections and influence provided him with crucial local support. This alliance represented more than just a personal relationship. It was a political statement that demonstrated Knut's commitment to working within existing English power structures rather than simply imposing Danish authority from above. The marriage also provided him with access to networks of loyalty and obligation that had been built up over generations of English political development. Equally important, though ultimately more problematic, was Knut's alliance with Edric Streona, one of the most powerful and notorious earls in England. Edric's support brought significant military resources and local knowledge, but his reputation for treachery and opportunism would prove to be a double-edged sword. The Earl's willingness to switch sides based on perceived advantage rather than genuine loyalty would complicate Knut's efforts to establish stable governance, though in the short term his support proved valuable in the renewed campaign for English control. The England that Knut invaded in 1015 was now divided between competing claims to legitimacy, with the ageing Ethelred controlling some regions while Danish forces held others. This division created the conditions for a bitter civil war that would rage across the kingdom for more than a year. The conflict was characterised not only by military confrontations, but also by the complex web of betrayals and shifting allegiances that made medieval warfare particularly devastating for civilian populations. The battles that followed were marked by their intensity and their strategic importance in determining the future of English governance. Across Mercia, Wessex, and the Midlands, armies clashed in engagements that often turned as much on political calculation as on military skill. The participation of English nobles on both sides of the conflict reflected the deep divisions within Anglo-Saxon society, and the extent to which traditional loyalties had been disrupted by decades of external pressure and internal failure. The death of Ethelred in April 1016 marked another crucial turning point in the struggle for England. The old king's passing removed a figure who, despite his failures, retained some claim to legitimate authority based on hereditary right and long-established precedent. However, rather than resolving the succession crisis, Ethelred's death simply transferred it to a new generation, as his son Edmund Ironside was elected king by the nobles of London and southern England. Edmund Ironside represented a very different kind of Anglo-Saxon leadership than his father had provided. Where Ethelred had been indecisive and ineffective, Edmund was energetic and militarily capable. His election demonstrated that there remained significant support for Anglo-Saxon rule among important segments of English society, particularly in the traditional heartlands of Wessex, where the dynasty had its deepest roots. However, Edmund's strengths as a military leader would be tested in a series of confrontations with Knut that would determine the ultimate fate of Anglo-Saxon England. The final phase of the Danish conquest played out through 5 major battles that showcased both the military capabilities of the opposing forces and the strategic importance of various regions within England. The battles of Penselwood, Schurston, and Brentford demonstrated that neither side possessed overwhelming superiority, while the complex loyalties and shifting allegiances of English nobles continued to complicate military planning and execution for both claimants to the throne. The decisive engagement came at the Battle of Asandun on October 18, 1016, where Knut's forces achieved a crushing victory over Edmund Ironside's army. This battle was notable not only for its military outcome, but also for the role played by treachery in determining its result. Edric Streona, true to his reputation for opportunism, switched sides during the battle itself, contributing to the collapse of Anglo-Saxon resistance at the crucial moment. The betrayal at Asandun illustrated the extent to which personal ambition and calculation had come to dominate English politics, making stable governance increasingly difficult to achieve. The aftermath of Asandun led to negotiations between the 2 surviving claimants to the English throne, resulting in the Treaty of Olney, which divided the kingdom between them. Under this agreement, Edmund retained control of Wessex, the traditional heartland of Anglo-Saxon power, while Knut was recognised as ruler of Mercia, Northumbria and East Anglia. This division represented a practical acknowledgement that neither side possessed the strength to eliminate the other completely, while also reflecting the regional nature of political loyalties within England. However, this carefully negotiated settlement was destined to be short-lived. On November the 30th, 1016, just weeks after the signing of the treaty, Edmund Ironside died under circumstances that remain mysterious to this day. Whether his death was natural or the result of assassination, it removed the last significant obstacle to complete Danish control over England. Edmund's death left Cnut as the sole claimant to royal authority, with both the military strength and political support necessary to make his claim effective. By the end of 1016, Cnut had been crowned King of all England, marking the successful completion of the Danish conquest that his father had begun 3 years earlier. However, the new king understood that military victory was only the beginning of the challenge he faced. Establishing stable and lasting rule over England would require the elimination of potential rivals, the cultivation of loyalty among the English nobility, and the creation of governmental systems that could effectively administer a kingdom that remained deeply divided by recent conflicts. Cnut's approach to consolidating his power revealed considerable political sophistication. Rather than simply ruling as a foreign conqueror, he sought to legitimize his authority through marriage to Emma of Normandy, the widow of his predecessor Ethelred. This marriage served multiple purposes. It provided a connection to the previous Anglo-Saxon dynasty. It created ties with the powerful Norman court, and it demonstrated Cnut's commitment to ruling as an English king rather than merely as a Danish overlord. The administrative system that Cnut established blended Anglo-Saxon and Norse traditions in ways that reflected the complex cultural landscape of early 11th century England. Rather than imposing Danish governmental structures wholesale, the new king worked to adapt existing English institutions to serve his purposes, while incorporating Scandinavian practices where they offered advantages. This synthesis of traditions helped to create a sense of continuity that made Danish rule more acceptable to English subjects, while also ensuring that governance remained effective. Central to Cnut's system of control was his careful management of the English nobility. He appointed loyal earls to key positions while rewarding those who had supported his cause and punishing those who had resisted too vigorously. However, his approach was generally marked by pragmatism rather than vindictiveness, as he recognised that lasting stability required the cooperation of established local leaders rather than their complete replacement. The king's ability to balance reward and punishment, inclusion and exclusion, demonstrated the political skills that had made his conquest possible and would make his rule sustainable. The consolidation of power in England was only the beginning of Cnut's imperial ambitions. In 1018, following the death of his brother Harold, Cnut succeeded to the throne of Denmark, uniting the Danish and English crowns under single rule for the first time. This personal union created the foundation for what would become the North Sea Empire, a maritime confederation that would dominate northern European politics for nearly 2 decades. The expansion of Cnut's authority continued with his conquest of Norway in 1028, where he was declared king by the Norwegian nobility. This achievement represented the pinnacle of Viking political success, as it brought together under one ruler the 3 kingdoms that had been the primary sources of Scandinavian expansion for centuries. The empire that Cnut had created stretched across the North Sea basin and controlled the maritime routes that were crucial to medieval trade and communication. Beyond his direct rule over England, Denmark and Norway, Cnut also maintained varying degrees of overlordship over parts of Scotland, Wales and Ireland. These relationships, based on a combination of military pressure and diplomatic negotiation, extended his influence throughout the British Isles and established him as the dominant political figure in Northern Europe. The extent of his authority was unprecedented in the medieval period and would not be matched again until the rise of later imperial powers. The North Sea Empire represented more than just political conquest. It was a unified economic and cultural zone that facilitated trade, communication, and cultural exchange on a scale previously unknown in Northern Europe. Merchants could travel from Dublin to Novgorod under the protection of a single sovereign, while ideas, technologies, and artistic influences flowed freely across traditional boundaries. The empire's control over crucial maritime routes generated enormous wealth through taxation and regulation of trade, providing the resources necessary to maintain the military and administrative apparatus required for such extensive rule. The impact of Danish conquest on Anglo-Saxon England was profound and lasting. The shift of political focus from the traditional Wessex-centred perspective to a broader North Sea orientation fundamentally altered England's role in European politics. Rather than being primarily concerned with Welsh raids or Scottish border conflicts, English policy now had to consider Danish succession disputes and Norwegian political developments. This broader perspective would influence English political thinking long after the collapse of Knut's empire. The administrative innovations introduced during Knut's reign strengthened royal bureaucracy and improved the effectiveness of governance in ways that would benefit his successors. The development of more sophisticated coinage systems, improved taxation methods, and enhanced legal procedures created governmental capabilities that had not existed under previous Anglo-Saxon rulers. These improvements demonstrated how foreign conquest could sometimes bring administrative benefits even as it displaced traditional authorities. Perhaps most significantly for the long-term development of English history, Knut's marriage to Emma of Normandy created connections that would prove crucial to future political developments. The children of this marriage would play important roles in the succession crises that followed Knut's death, while Emma's Norman connections would help to establish the relationships that would eventually lead to the Norman conquest of 1066. In this sense, the Danish conquest served as a bridge between the Anglo-Saxon and Norman periods of English history. The cultural and religious implications of Danish rule were equally significant. The continued Christianization of Scandinavia, accelerated by the close connection between Danish and English churches, helped to integrate the Viking world more fully into European Christian civilization. Scandinavian influence on English legal and social institutions created hybrid systems that combined Germanic, Norse and Christian elements in new and distinctive ways. These cultural syntheses enriched English civilization, while also making it more cosmopolitan and internationally connected. However, the very extent of Knut's empire contained the seeds of its own destruction. The death of the great king in 1035 revealed the extent to which the North Sea Empire had depended on his personal authority and political skill. Without a single figure capable of maintaining the complex web of relationships and obligations that held the empire together, the Confederation began to fragment almost immediately after Knut's passing. The succession crisis that followed Knut's death was complicated by the existence of multiple potential heirs, with competing claims to different parts of his empire. His sons, Harold Harefoot and Harthacnut, represented differentes constituencies and interests, while the sons of his marriage to Emma of Normandy added additional complications to an already complex situation. The inability of these potential successors to cooperate or to establish clear lines of authority led to conflicts that quickly undermined the stability of the empire. By 1042, the great experiment in Scandinavian imperialism had effectively ended with the restoration of the Anglo-Saxon line under Edward the Confessor. This restoration represented not just a return to previous political arrangements, but also a recognition that the Danish conquest, for all its apparent success, had failed to create lasting institutional changes that could survive the death of its creator. The North Sea Empire, which had seemed so formidable at its height, proved to be ultimately dependent on the exceptional abilities of a single ruler. The legacy of the Danish conquest of England extends far beyond the relatively brief period of actual Danish rule. The demonstration that England could be successfully invaded and conquered by a determined foreign power provided a template that would be followed by later conquerors, most notably William of Normandy in 1066. The political and administrative innovations introduced during Knut's reign influenced English governmental development for centuries, while the cultural exchanges facilitated by the North Sea Empire enriched English civilization in ways that persisted long after the empire's collapse. The story of Sweyn Forkbeard and Knut's conquest of England also illustrates the complex relationship between military success and political stability in the medieval period. While both father and son demonstrated exceptional military and political skills, their achievements ultimately depended on personal authority rather than institutional strength. The rapid collapse of their empire after Knut's death revealed the limitations of conquest-based political systems and highlighted the importance of legitimate succession mechanisms in maintaining stable governance. The Danish conquest of England stands as one of the most remarkable political achievements of the medieval period, representing the successful integration of England into a broader Scandinavian world that stretched across northern Europe. For nearly 3 decades, from Sweyn's initial invasion in 1013 to the restoration of Anglo-Saxon rule in 1042, England was part of a maritime empire that controlled the North Sea and influenced political developments from Ireland to the Baltic. The ultimate failure of this empire to establish permanent institutions should not obscure the magnitude of its temporary success or its lasting influence on English political and cultural development. The conquest also demonstrates the importance of political division and weak leadership in creating opportunities for foreign intervention. Ethelred's failures as a ruler created the conditions that made Danish conquest possible, while the divisions within Anglo-Saxon society provided the Danish conquerors with crucial allies and supporters. The lesson that effective governance and national unity are essential for maintaining independence would be repeated throughout English history, though it was not always successfully applied. In the broader context of European history, the Danish conquest of England represents the high point of Viking political achievement and the successful adaptation of traditional Scandinavian warrior culture to the requirements of sophisticated governmental administration. Knut's empire demonstrated that the Vikings were capable of more than mere raiding and pillaging. They could create and maintain complex political structures that rivaled the best governmental achievements of their time. The ultimate collapse of this empire marked the end of the Viking Age as a period of Scandinavian expansion and the beginning of a new phase in Northern European political development. The economic implications of the Danish conquest extended far beyond the immediate political changes it brought to England. The integration of England into Knut's North Sea Empire created new patterns of trade and commerce that fundamentally altered the economic geography of Northern Europe. English silver, which had previously flowed to Scandinavia primarily through the payment of Danegeld, now moved through more complex commercial networks that linked London merchants with Danish traders and Norwegian fishermen. This economic integration created interdependencies that outlasted the political structures that initially facilitated them. The transformation of England's military organisation under Danish rule represented another significant aspect of the conquest's impact. The traditional Anglo-Saxon fyrd system, based on local levies and personal obligations, was supplemented and gradually modified by Scandinavian military practices that emphasised professional warriors and maritime capabilities. The housecarls, elite troops that formed the core of Knut's military force, represented a departure from earlier English military traditions and would influence English military organisation well into the Norman period. The religious dimensions of the Danish conquest also deserve careful consideration. While Knut and his followers were Christians, their form of Christianity had developed in a different context from that of Anglo-Saxon England. The interaction between Danish and English Christian traditions led to subtle but important changes in religious practice and institutional organisation. Monasteries that had been centres of Anglo-Saxon learning and culture had to adapt to new patronage patterns and political realities, while the English Church found itself more closely connected to continental European religious developments through its Danish rulers' broader imperial connections. The architectural and artistic legacy of the Danish period, though often overlooked, provides valuable insights into the cultural transformations that accompanied political conquest. The building projects undertaken during Knut's reign reflected both Scandinavian aesthetic preferences and English craft traditions, creating hybrid styles that would influence subsequent architectural development. Stone churches built during this period show evidence of decorative elements that derive from both Norse and Anglo-Saxon traditions, while manuscript illumination and metalwork from the era demonstrate similar patterns of cultural synthesis. The legal and administrative innovations of the Danish period had particularly lasting significance for English governmental development. The law codes promulgated under Knut represented sophisticated attempts to reconcile different legal traditions while maintaining effective governance over a diverse population. These legal syntheses addressed practical problems of governing a multi-ethnic kingdom while also establishing precedents that would influence English legal development for centuries. The integration of Scandinavian legal concepts, particularly those relating to maritime commerce and military service, enriched English jurisprudence in ways that proved beneficial long after Danish rule had ended. The diplomatic achievements of Knut's reign demonstrated the extent to which the Danish conquest had elevated England's international standing. The marriages and alliances that Knut negotiated connected England to royal houses throughout northern and western Europe, creating diplomatic networks that enhanced the kingdom's security and commercial prospects. These international connections represented a significant departure from the more insular policies that had characterised much of Anglo-Saxon governance, and they established patterns of European engagement that would influence English foreign policy development. The personal tragedy that accompanied the collapse of Knut's empire was most evident in the fate of his immediate family and closest supporters. The succession struggles that followed his death were marked by violence and betrayal that destroyed many of the relationships and institutions that had made the North Sea Empire possible. Harold Harefoot's brief and troubled reign from 1035 to 1040 demonstrated the difficulties inherent in maintaining Danish control over England, without the unifying authority that Knut had provided. The subsequent rule of Harthacnut from 1040 to 1042 was marked by harsh taxation and political instability that alienated many of the English subjects who had accepted Danish rule under more favourable circumstances. The restoration of Anglo-Saxon rule under Edward the Confessor in 1042 marked the apparent end of the Danish experiment in English governance, but the influences of that period persisted in numerous ways. Edward himself was a product of the complex international relationships that had characterised the Danish period, having spent his formative years in Norman exile, where he had been influenced by continental European political and cultural traditions. His reign represented not a simple return to pre-conquest Anglo-Saxon traditions, but rather a synthesis of Anglo-Saxon, Danish, and Norman influences that reflected the cosmopolitan character that England had acquired during the Danish period. The military and naval innovations that had made the Danish conquest possible continued to influence English strategic thinking long after the restoration of native rule. The demonstration that England could be successfully invaded by seaborne forces had revealed vulnerabilities in traditional defensive arrangements, while also suggesting new possibilities for English expansion and influence. The naval technologies and techniques that the Danes had brought to England were absorbed into English military practice, contributing to the development of English naval capabilities that would prove crucial in later conflicts. The commercial networks that had been established during the Danish period proved remarkably durable, continuing to function even as political control shifted back to Anglo-Saxon hands. English merchants who had developed trading relationships with Scandinavian partners maintained those connections, while the administrative and legal frameworks that had facilitated commerce during Knut's reign continued to influence English commercial development. These economic continuities helped to ensure that the benefits of international integration were not entirely lost with the collapse of the political structures that had originally created them. The intellectual and cultural exchanges that had been facilitated by the Danish conquest also left lasting marks on English civilization. Scholars and clerics who had moved between England and other parts of Knut's empire brought new ideas and perspectives that enriched English intellectual life. Manuscript traditions, artistic techniques, and scholarly practices that had been developed during the period of Danish rule continued to influence English cultural development well into the later medieval period. The demographic changes that had occurred during the Danish period were equally significant for England's long-term development. The immigration of Danish settlers and administrators had altered the ethnic composition of certain regions, particularly in areas where Scandinavian influence had been strongest. These new populations brought different customs, languages, and economic practices that added to the complexity of English society, while also contributing to its vitality and adaptability. The technological innovations that had been introduced or promoted during the Danish period also had lasting impact on English development. Improvements in shipbuilding, metallurgy, and agricultural techniques that had been brought from Scandinavia or developed through the interaction of different traditions continued to benefit English society, long after the political circumstances that had originally facilitated their introduction had changed. The historiographical significance of the Danish conquest has continued to evolve as scholars have gained new perspectives on the period and its significance. Early accounts, often written from Anglo-Saxon perspectives, tended to emphasise the destructive aspects of the conquest, while minimising its constructive contributions to English development. More recent scholarship has recognised the complexity of the period and the extent to which the Danish conquest represented a successful, if temporary, example of medieval imperial organisation. The parallels between the Danish conquest and later foreign conquests of England, particularly the Norman conquest of 1066, have provided valuable insights into the dynamics of medieval conquest and rule. The comparison reveals both the possibilities and limitations of conquest-based governance, while also highlighting the importance of institutional development and legitimacy in maintaining stable rule over diverse populations. The relative success of the Norman conquest in establishing lasting institutions contrasts with the Danish failure to create enduring governmental structures, suggesting important lessons about the requirements for successful imperial governance. The archaeological evidence from the Danish period continues to provide new insights into the character and impact of Scandinavian rule in England. Excavations at sites throughout the country have revealed material evidence of the cultural exchanges and economic changes that accompanied the conquest, while also documenting the ways in which local populations adapted to new political and cultural circumstances. This physical evidence complements and sometimes challenges the documentary sources, providing a more complete picture of this crucial period in English history. The linguistic legacy of the Danish conquest remains evident in modern English, where numerous words of Scandinavian origin testify to the depth of cultural interaction that occurred during this period. The influence of Old Norse on English vocabulary, grammar, and pronunciation reflects not merely temporary political dominance, but genuine cultural synthesis that occurred at all levels of society. This linguistic evidence suggests that the Danish conquest had impacts that extended far beyond the political and military spheres to encompass fundamental aspects of English cultural identity. The ultimate assessment of the Danish conquest of England must acknowledge both its remarkable achievements and its ultimate limitations. For nearly 3 decades, Scandinavian rulers successfully governed England as part of a broader imperial system that demonstrated unprecedented sophistication and scope. The administrative, military and diplomatic innovations of this period contributed significantly to English development, while also establishing England as a major power in Northern European politics. However, the failure to create lasting institutional foundations meant that these achievements proved ephemeral, unable to survive the death of the extraordinary ruler who had made them possible. The story of the Danish conquest thus serves as both an inspiration and a cautionary tale about the possibilities and limitations of medieval political organisation. It demonstrates the potential for creative synthesis between different cultures and traditions, while also revealing the difficulties inherent in maintaining complex political structures across diverse populations and territories. The legacy of this remarkable period continues to influence our understanding of medieval history and the development of English civilization, reminding us that the past is often more complex and sophisticated than simple narratives of national development might suggest. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty plains of southeastern Italy as 2 massive armies prepared for what would become one of history's most decisive battles. The year was 216 BCE, and the Second Punic War had already raged for 2 brutal years, transforming the Western Mediterranean into a theatre of unprecedented destruction and ambition. On one side stood Rome, the rising power whose legions had conquered most of Italy through disciplined warfare and relentless expansion. On the other stood Carthage, the ancient maritime empire whose very existence now hung in the balance, represented by a polyglot army led by one of history's most brilliant military minds. The conflict had begun 2 years earlier when Hannibal Barca, the young Carthaginian general, had done the unthinkable. Rather than accept Rome's growing dominance or fight a conventional naval war in the Mediterranean, he had chosen to strike at the heart of Roman power by launching an audacious overland invasion of Italy itself. The journey had been legendary in its scope and suffering. Hannibal had marched his diverse army of Africans, Spaniards and Gauls through the treacherous passes of the Alps, losing nearly half his men to cold, starvation and the fierce resistance of mountain tribes. Yet what remained was a hardened, veteran force that had already proven its mettle against Roman armies. The shock of Hannibal's appearance in northern Italy had reverberated through Rome like an earthquake. For centuries the Romans had fought their wars on foreign soil, pushing their boundaries ever outward while their homeland remained secure behind the natural barriers of sea and mountain. Now, suddenly enemy forces were ravaging the fertile plains of the Po Valley, and Roman citizens were fleeing their farms as Carthaginian cavalry thundered across fields their families had tilled for generations. The first encounters had gone disastrously for Rome. At the Trebia River in 218 BCE, Hannibal had demonstrated his tactical genius by drawing a Roman army into a carefully prepared ambush. Using the bitter December cold and his superior knowledge of the terrain, he had positioned troops in hidden positions along the riverbank. When the Roman legions crossed the icy waters to engage what they believed was Hannibal's main force, they found themselves attacked from all sides by fresh troops who had been concealed through the night. The slaughter had been comprehensive, with thousands of Roman soldiers cut down in the freezing mud or drowned in the swollen river. The following year brought an even more stunning defeat at Lake Trasimene. Here, Hannibal had perfected the art of the ambush on a massive scale. He had positioned his army in the hills overlooking the narrow pass between the lake and the mountains, then waited for the pursuing Roman army to march into what was essentially a killing ground. As morning mist rose from the lake, obscuring visibility, the Carthaginians had fallen upon the Roman column from 3 sides simultaneously. The consul Gaius Flaminius had died in the fighting, and his army had been virtually annihilated. So complete was the destruction that it took days for news of the disaster to reach Rome, and when it did, panic gripped the city. In response to these catastrophes, Rome had turned to Quintus Fabius Maximus, a cautious general who understood that conventional tactics would only lead to further disasters against Hannibal's superior generalship. Fabius had adopted a strategy of harassment and attrition, avoiding pitched battles while constantly shadowing the Carthaginian army. His troops would strike at Hannibal's foragers, cut off stragglers, and deny the enemy army the decisive victory it sought, while protecting Roman towns and supply lines. This approach, which came to be known as Fabian tactics, had frustrated Hannibal's attempts to force a conclusive engagement, and had earned Fabius the mocking nickname Cunctator, the delayer. But the Roman Senate and people had grown impatient with this cautious approach. The sight of enemy troops ravaging Italian soil while Roman armies seemed to cower in the hills was more than Roman pride could bear. The economy was suffering as trade routes were disrupted and agricultural production declined in the war zones. Perhaps most importantly, Rome's network of Italian allies was beginning to waver as they questioned whether their powerful patron could truly protect them from this Carthaginian threat. The pressure for decisive action had reached a crescendo in the spring of 216 BCE, when 2 new consuls were elected to lead Rome's military response. Gaius Terentius Varro represented the popular party and the common people's demand for aggressive action against the invaders. He was a man of humble origins who had risen through Rome's cursus honorum through political skill and populist appeals rather than military distinction. His speeches in the Forum had electrified crowds with promises to end the war quickly through bold offensive action. Lucius Aemilius Paulus, by contrast, represented the aristocratic faction and favoured a more measured approach. He was a seasoned general who had commanded legions in previous campaigns and understood the complexities of warfare against a cunning enemy like Hannibal. The tension between these 2 men reflected the broader divisions within Roman society about how to respond to the Carthaginian threat. Varro accused the aristocrats of cowardice and self-interest, claiming they prolonged the war to maintain their commands and enrich themselves at the state's expense. Paulus and his supporters countered that rash action would only lead to more disasters like Trebia and Trasimene. However, the popular will for aggressive action proved overwhelming, and the Senate authorized the raising of the largest army in Roman history to that point. The mobilization that followed was unprecedented in scale and ambition. Rome called up not only its own citizens, but also demanded contingents from every allied city and tribe throughout Italy. Veterans were recalled from retirement. Young men barely old enough to bear arms were pressed into service, and even slaves were offered freedom in exchange for military service. The entire Roman war machine was focused on creating a force so massive that it could overwhelm Hannibal through sheer numbers, regardless of his tactical superiority. When the levies were complete, Rome had assembled an army of approximately 80 to 90,000 men, divided into 8 legions plus an equal number of allied troops. This represented nearly 10% of Rome's entire military-age male population, a commitment that demonstrated both the state's desperation and its confidence in numerical superiority. The logistics of supplying and moving such a massive force was staggering, requiring thousands of pack animals, hundreds of supply wagons, and a complex network of depots and supply lines stretching back to Rome itself. Meanwhile, Hannibal's army had been reduced by 2 years of continuous campaigning to perhaps 40 to 50,000 effective fighters. However, what these men lacked in numbers they more than compensated for in experience and diversity. The core of his infantry consisted of Libyan troops, veterans of campaigns in Spain and Africa, who fought with captured Roman equipment and had adopted many Roman tactical innovations while retaining their own traditions of individual combat skill. These were supplemented by Gallic warriors from tribes in both Spain and northern Italy, fierce fighters who brought their own weapons and fighting styles to the Carthaginian cause. Spanish infantry provided another crucial element, disciplined troops armed with their distinctive falcata swords and experienced in both individual and formation combat. But perhaps Hannibal's greatest advantage lay in his cavalry, which was both more numerous and far superior in quality to anything the Romans could field. Numidian light cavalry from North Africa were legendary throughout the Mediterranean for their skill as horse archers and their ability to harass enemy formations while remaining virtually uncatchable in open terrain. These riders, who fought without saddles or bridles and controlled their mounts through knee pressure alone, could appear suddenly from clouds of dust, rain javelins and arrows on enemy formations, and disappear again before retaliation was possible. Heavy cavalry from Spain and Gaul provided the shock troops necessary for decisive charges, while their superior numbers meant that Hannibal could use mounted forces not just for reconnaissance and harassment, but as a genuine tactical arm capable of deciding battles. The diversity of Hannibal's army was both a strength and a challenge. Managing troops who spoke different languages, fought with different weapons, and came from cultures with vastly different military traditions required exceptional leadership and organisational skill. Yet this diversity also provided tactical flexibility that no homogeneous army could match. Hannibal could adapt his battle plans to take advantage of each unit's particular strengths, while compensating for their weaknesses through the complementary abilities of other contingents. As summer approached, both armies began manoeuvring through the heat-baked landscape of southeastern Italy, each seeking to force battle under favourable conditions. Hannibal had established a base near the town of Cannae, a Roman supply depot that controlled access to the rich agricultural regions of Apulia. The position was strategically crucial because it threatened Rome's grain supplies from the south, while providing Hannibal's army with access to the resources they needed to continue the campaign. More importantly, from a tactical perspective, the terrain around Cannae offered the open plains that would allow his superior cavalry to operate most effectively. The landscape around Cannae was dominated by gently rolling hills that descended toward the Aufidus River, known today as the Ofanto. The river valley provided relatively flat ground ideal for large-scale manoeuvres, while the surrounding elevations offered observation posts and potential positions for reserves. The summer heat was already intense, and dust clouds raised by marching armies could be seen for miles across the sun-scorched terrain. Local winds typically blew from the southeast, carrying dust and reducing visibility for anyone facing that direction, a factor that Hannibal would carefully consider in his battle planning. When the Roman army finally approached Cannae in early August, both sides understood that the moment of decision had arrived. The Romans could not allow Hannibal to continue threatening their supply lines and recruiting allies from among the Italian tribes, while Hannibal knew that his strategic position would become untenable if he could not force a decisive victory soon. Carthaginian reinforcements remained trapped in Spain by Roman naval power, and his army's numerical inferiority meant that a prolonged campaign of attrition would inevitably favour Rome. The night before the battle, both camps were alive with activity as commanders made their final preparations. In the Roman camp, Varro and Paulus held council with their subordinate officers, reviewing battle plans and attempting to coordinate the movements of their massive army. The size of their force created both opportunities and challenges. While their numbers were overwhelming, the complexity of managing so many troops in battle had never been attempted before. Roman military doctrine emphasized the disciplined advance of heavy infantry in close formation, an approach that had proven successful against most enemies, but had already failed disastrously against Hannibal's more flexible tactics. Across the plain, Hannibal was putting the finishing touches on one of history's most audacious battle plans. Rather than simply arranging his troops in the strongest possible defensive formation, he was preparing to deliberately weaken his centre while strengthening his flanks, creating a formation that would appear vulnerable to Roman attack while actually serving as bait for an elaborate trap. The plan required precise timing, exceptional discipline from his troops, and the kind of battlefield control that few generals in history have ever achieved. As dawn broke on August 2nd, 216 BCE, both armies began their deployment across the dusty plains. The morning sun climbed higher in a cloudless sky, promising another day of punishing heat that would test the endurance of heavily armoured men engaged in desperate combat. A hot wind blew from the southeast, stirring up clouds of fine dust that would limit visibility and add to the confusion once battle was joined. Hannibal positioned his army with careful attention to both the terrain and the prevailing wind conditions. His weakest troops, Gallic and Spanish infantry, were placed in the centre of his line, arranged in a convex formation that actually projected toward the enemy. This was contrary to every conventional military practice, as it invited attack against the army's most vulnerable point. However, Hannibal's intention was precisely to encourage such an attack, drawing the Roman legions into what would become a deadly trap. On either side of this weak centre, Hannibal positioned his best infantry, veteran Libyan troops equipped with Roman weapons and armour captured in previous battles. These men were arranged in columns rather than extended lines, hidden behind the forward units, and ready to wheel inward once the Romans had committed to their attack on the centre. On the extreme flanks, Hannibal deployed his cavalry forces, with Numidian light horse on the right wing and heavy cavalry commanded by his brother Hasdrubal on the left. The Roman deployment followed more conventional patterns, reflecting both their military traditions and their confidence in superior numbers. The massive infantry force was arranged in the traditional manipular system, with Hastati in front, Principes in the middle ranks, and Triarii veterans forming the rear line. However, the unprecedented size of the army meant that the usual spacing between maniples had to be reduced, creating a more dense and less flexible formation than normal. This compression would prove crucial as the battle developed, as it reduced the Romans' ability to respond to changing tactical situations. Roman cavalry was divided between the flanks, with citizen cavalry under Paulus positioned on the right wing and allied horse under Varro on the left. Both forces were significantly outnumbered by their Carthaginian counterparts, and neither was equipped or trained for the kind of decisive cavalry action that Hannibal planned to employ. Roman military doctrine treated cavalry primarily as a supporting arm for scouting and pursuit, rather than as a battle-winning force in its own right. When the battle commenced, the initial exchanges followed patterns that were familiar from previous engagements. Roman cavalry on both flanks moved forward to engage their Carthaginian counterparts, while the massive infantry formations began their methodical advance toward Hannibal's apparently vulnerable centre. The dust raised by thousands of marching feet and galloping horses began to fill the air, reducing visibility and adding to the confusion that always accompanies large-scale combat. On the Roman right flank, Paulus led his cavalry in a desperate charge against Hasdrubal's heavy horse, but the encounter was brief and decisive. The Carthaginian cavalry, better trained and more numerous, quickly gained the upper hand. Paulus himself was wounded in the fighting and forced to withdraw, leaving his scattered forces unable to provide effective support for the infantry. On the opposite flank, Varro's allied cavalry fared even worse against the Numidian light horse, who used their superior mobility to avoid direct confrontation, while raining javelins on the Roman formations. With both flanks secured, the crucial phase of the battle shifted to the infantry combat in the centre. Here, Hannibal's plan began to unfold with mechanical precision. As the Roman legions crashed into the Gallic and Spanish troops in the Carthaginian centre, these deliberately weakened units began to give ground, falling back in apparent disorder while maintaining just enough cohesion to avoid complete collapse. To the Roman commanders, this retreat looked like the beginning of victory. Their superior numbers and discipline were finally overwhelming the enemy centre, just as conventional military wisdom suggested they should. The Roman advance continued with increasing momentum as more and more legions pressed forward into the gap that seemed to be opening in the Carthaginian line. The manipular system that had served Rome so well in previous wars now worked against them, as the forward units became increasingly compressed and difficult to control. Officers found themselves unable to maintain communication with troops more than a few ranks away, while the dust and noise of battle made coordinated manoeuvres nearly impossible. What the Romans could not see, however, was that Hannibal's retreat was proceeding according to a carefully orchestrated plan. As the Gallic and Spanish troops fell back, they maintained their formation and continued to resist, drawing more and more Roman forces into an increasingly narrow salient. Meanwhile, the African heavy infantry on either side of this developing bulge remained motionless, waiting for the signal to execute the most crucial phase of the battle. The moment Hannibal had been waiting for arrived when the Roman advance had penetrated so deeply into his centre that the leading legions were actually behind the original Carthaginian front line. At this point, the African infantry on both flanks received their orders and began to wheel inward, turning to attack the exposed sides of the Roman formation. These troops, fresh and unengaged until this moment, struck the surprised Romans with devastating effect. Simultaneously, Hasdrubal's cavalry, having routed the Roman horse on their front, swept around the rear of the battlefield to attack the Roman infantry from behind. The Numidians joined this assault, and suddenly the massive Roman army found itself attacked from 4 directions simultaneously. What had begun as an apparently successful advance had become a desperate fight for survival, with Roman legions trapped in an ever-tightening circle of enemies. The encirclement that followed was both tactically brilliant and strategically devastating. As the Carthaginian forces contracted their circle, the Romans found themselves compressed into an increasingly small space, where their numerical superiority became a liability rather than an asset. Men could not wield their weapons effectively in the crush, officers could not maneuver their units, and panic began to spread through the ranks as soldiers realized the full extent of their predicament. The slaughter that followed was methodical and comprehensive. Trapped Romans were cut down by spears and swords, trampled by their own comrades, or simply crushed in the press of bodies as the Carthaginian circle grew ever smaller. Some attempts were made to break out of the encirclement, but these were quickly suppressed by fresh Carthaginian troops who had been held in reserve for exactly this purpose. The superior training and equipment that had made Roman legions so effective in open battle became meaningless in the confused melee that the battle had become. Paulus, the consul who had favoured caution, died fighting in the ranks alongside his men, refusing offers of escape and choosing to share the fate of the soldiers he had led into disaster. His colleague Varro managed to escape with a small body of cavalry, but the vast majority of the Roman army was either killed or captured. The casualties were staggering even by the brutal standards of ancient warfare. Estimates suggest that between 50 and 70,000 Romans died on the field of Cannae, making it one of the bloodiest single days in military history. Among the dead were not just common soldiers, but much of Rome's military and political leadership. 80 senators perished in the battle, along with numerous other magistrates, officers, and members of prominent families. The cream of Roman society had been wiped out in a single afternoon, leaving the state facing not just military defeat, but a crisis of leadership that threatened its very survival. When news of the disaster reached Rome, the city was gripped by panic unlike anything in its history. Citizens fled to their homes, shops closed, and rumours spread that Hannibal was already marching on the city. The Senate met in emergency session to coordinate what seemed like preparations for a siege, while magistrates struggled to maintain order among a population that had suddenly realised their apparent invincibility was an illusion. Yet perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the aftermath was Hannibal's decision not to march immediately on Rome itself. His officers urged him to advance on the capital, while panic still gripped the city, and before the Romans could organise new defences. Some historians suggest that the city might indeed have fallen if Hannibal had struck immediately, while the psychological impact of Cannae was still paralysing Roman resistance. Instead, Hannibal chose to consolidate his victory by attempting to break up Rome's system of alliances throughout Italy. He released captured allied troops without ransom, hoping to convince them that Carthage offered better terms than Rome. He sent diplomatic missions to wavering Italian cities, promising favourable treatment to those who abandoned the Roman cause. This strategy was not without success. Several important cities, including Capua, the second largest in Italy, declared for Carthage in the months following Cannae. However, Hannibal's strategic pause also gave Rome the time it desperately needed to recover from the immediate shock of defeat. The Romans' response to Cannae demonstrated the resilience and institutional strength that would eventually enable them to dominate the Mediterranean world. Rather than seeking peace or abandoning the war effort, the Senate authorised new levies to replace the lost legions, recalled experienced commanders from other theatres, and implemented emergency measures to maintain the war effort. The Roman strategy shifted back to the Fabian tactics that had frustrated Hannibal before Cannae. New armies were raised with explicit instructions to avoid pitched battles, while harassing Carthaginian forces and protecting loyal cities. The Romans also implemented a scorched earth policy in areas controlled by Hannibal, denying his army the supplies it needed for extended operations while gradually wearing down his forces through attrition. Perhaps most importantly, Rome's network of alliances proved more resilient than Hannibal had anticipated. While some cities did defect to Carthage, the majority remained loyal to Rome, motivated by a combination of fear, self-interest, and genuine belief in Roman protection. This loyalty was maintained through a careful balance of threats and rewards, as Rome demonstrated that it could still protect its friends while ruthlessly punishing those who betrayed their alliance. The war continued for another 14 years after Cannae, with Hannibal maintaining his position in Italy, but unable to achieve the decisive victory that would force Rome to sue for peace. His army gradually declined in strength as casualties mounted, and reinforcements from Carthage remained limited by Roman naval superiority. Meanwhile, Roman forces under Publius Cornelius Scipio opened a new front in Spain, eventually driving Carthaginian forces from their Iberian strongholds and threatening Carthage itself. The final resolution came at the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, where Scipio used tactics derived from studying Hannibal's own methods to defeat the Carthaginian general on African soil. The irony was complete when Scipio, later surnamed Africanus in honour of his victory, employed a modified version of the double envelopment that Hannibal had perfected at Cannae to achieve Rome's ultimate triumph in the Second Punic War. The Battle of Cannae's influence on military thinking extended far beyond the immediate conflict between Rome and Carthage. The double envelopment manoeuvre that Hannibal executed so brilliantly became the gold standard for tactical excellence, studied and emulated by generals throughout history. Napoleon Bonaparte analysed the battle extensively and attempted to replicate its principles in his own campaigns, while German staff officers in both world wars sought to achieve Cannae-like encirclements of enemy forces. The American Civil War saw several attempts to recreate Cannae's tactical model, most notably at the Battle of Chickamauga, where Confederate forces achieved a partial double envelopment of Union troops. During World War II, the German concept of blitzkrieg was explicitly designed to achieve Cannae-style encirclements on a strategic scale, using rapid armoured advances to surround and destroy entire enemy army groups. Even in the modern era, military academies around the world continue to study Cannae as an example of tactical perfection achieved through superior generalship, careful planning, and flawless execution under pressure. The battle demonstrates how a smaller, weaker force can achieve decisive victory through superior strategy and the intelligent use of terrain, weather, and enemy psychology. The psychological impact of Cannae extended beyond its immediate military consequences to influence Roman national character in ways that would shape the empire's future development. The disaster taught Romans that their survival as a people depended not on avoiding defeat but on their ability to recover from catastrophic setbacks. This lesson would serve them well in future crises, from the invasions of Germanic tribes to the civil wars that marked the end of the Republic. The memory of Cannae also reinforced Roman determination never again to allow foreign armies to ravage Italian soil unopposed. This defensive mentality contributed to Rome's aggressive expansion throughout the Mediterranean, as successive generations of leaders concluded that the best defence lay in controlling potential threats at their source, rather than waiting for enemies to strike at Roman territory. For Hannibal himself, Cannae represented both the pinnacle of his military genius and the beginning of his strategic failure. His tactical brilliance in achieving the perfect battle was matched by his inability to translate battlefield victory into lasting political success. The decision not to march on Rome immediately after Cannae has been debated by historians for over 2 millennia, with some arguing that the opportunity for decisive victory was lost forever in those crucial days following the battle. Modern analysis suggests that Hannibal's strategy of attempting to break up Roman alliances through diplomacy rather than military conquest was not necessarily flawed, but that he underestimated both Roman resilience and the strength of the alliance system he sought to destroy. His army, while tactically superior, lacked the logistical support and reinforcements necessary for the kind of sustained campaign that would have been required to force Rome's capitulation. The Battle of Cannae thus stands as both a testament to individual military genius and a demonstration of the limits of tactical excellence when not supported by adequate strategic resources. Hannibal's achievement in destroying a Roman army twice the size of his own remains one of history's greatest military accomplishments, yet his inability to capitalise on this victory ultimately contributed to Carthage's defeat in the broader war. Today, the plains around Cannae remain largely agricultural, with few visible traces of the carnage that once soaked the dusty soil with the blood of tens of thousands of soldiers. Archaeological investigations have uncovered artefacts from the battle, corroded weapons, armour fragments, and coins that provide physical evidence of the ancient conflict. These silent witnesses serve as reminders of a day when the fate of the Western world hung in the balance, decided by the tactical genius of one man and the courage of soldiers from across the Mediterranean who fought and died under the burning Italian sun. The legacy of Cannae extends beyond military history to encompass broader questions about leadership, strategy, and the relationship between tactical excellence and strategic success. It reminds us that individual brilliance, while crucial, must be supported by adequate resources and long-term planning to achieve lasting results. Most importantly, it demonstrates how a single day's fighting can echo through millennia, influencing military thinking and shaping the course of civilizations long after the dust of battle has settled and the warriors have returned to Earth. The immediate weeks following Cannae reveal the true character of both civilizations involved in this titanic struggle. While Hannibal celebrated his victory and attempted to capitalize on Roman panic, the response from Rome itself demonstrated the institutional resilience that would ultimately prove decisive in the broader conflict. The Senate, despite losing 80 of its members in the battle, continued to function and make crucial decisions about the war effort. Emergency magistrates were appointed to replace fallen leaders, new levies were authorized despite the catastrophic losses, and diplomatic missions were dispatched to ensure the loyalty of wavering allies. The Roman people's reaction to the disaster was perhaps even more remarkable than their government's response. Rather than demanding peace negotiations or calling for the recall of armies from other theatres, the citizenry demonstrated a grim determination to continue the struggle regardless of cost. Families who had lost sons, fathers and brothers at Cannae volunteered remaining male relatives for military service. Wealthy Romans contributed their personal fortunes to fund new legions, while poorer citizens offered their labour for fortification work and military production. This collective response was rooted in Roman cultural values that elevated duty to the state above individual survival or comfort. The concept of virtues, which encompassed courage, excellence, and moral strength, had been tested at Cannae and found to endure even in the face of unprecedented catastrophe. Romans understood that their civilization faced an existential threat, and they were prepared to sacrifice everything to ensure its survival. Hannibal, observing this Roman response from his camp in southern Italy, must have realized that his victory at Cannae, devastating as it was, had not achieved its primary strategic objective of forcing Rome to seek terms. Instead of breaking Roman will to resist, the battle seemed to have hardened their determination to continue the war until Carthage was completely defeated. The psychological warfare that had been so effective in previous campaigns was proving insufficient against an enemy whose cultural identity was built around the refusal to accept defeat. The diplomatic offensive that Hannibal launched in the aftermath of Cannae met with mixed results that highlighted the complex nature of Roman power in Italy. While some cities did abandon the Roman alliance, particularly in southern Italy where Carthaginian military presence offered immediate protection, the vast majority remained loyal despite the obvious military risks. This loyalty was based not merely on fear of Roman retaliation, but on genuine calculation of long-term interests and cultural affinity. Rome's alliance system differed fundamentally from the tributary relationships that characterized most ancient empires. Rather than simply extracting wealth and manpower from subject peoples, Rome offered a path to citizenship and full participation in Roman civilization. Italian allies understood that Roman defeat would not necessarily improve their situation, while Roman victory offered the possibility of advancement within an expanding imperial system. The defection of Capua, however, represented a significant strategic blow that demonstrated both the opportunities and limitations of Hannibal's diplomatic approach. As the second largest city in Italy and the centre of a rich agricultural region, Capua's adherence to the Carthaginian cause provided Hannibal with crucial logistical support and a prestigious symbol of Roman weakness. The city's leaders calculated that Carthaginian victory was inevitable and sought to position themselves advantageously in the post-war settlement. Yet Capua's defection also illustrated the fundamental problem with Hannibal's strategy. The city's decision was based on the assumption that Carthaginian military success would continue indefinitely, and that Rome lacked the resources to recover from defeats like Cannae. When these assumptions proved incorrect, Capua found itself isolated and vulnerable to Roman retaliation, ultimately suffering a brutal siege and harsh punishment that served as an object lesson to other potential defectors. The gradual shift in Roman strategy following Cannae demonstrated remarkable institutional learning and adaptability. The appointment of Marcus Claudius Marcellus as a key military commander marked the beginning of a more aggressive approach that combined Fabian harassment tactics with opportunistic strikes against isolated Carthaginian forces. Marcellus earned the nickname Sword of Rome for his willingness to engage Hannibal's army when circumstances offered reasonable chances of success. This evolving Roman approach was exemplified in the Siege of Syracuse, where Marcellus demonstrated that Roman forces could still achieve decisive victories against sophisticated opponents. The lengthy siege showcased Roman engineering capabilities and logistical endurance, while the eventual capture of the city eliminated a potential source of support for Carthage in Sicily. The death of Archimedes during the siege, despite Roman orders to capture him alive, symbolised the tragic costs of the broader conflict. Meanwhile, the emergence of Publius Cornelius Scipio as a major Roman commander marked the beginning of a new phase in the war that would ultimately lead to Carthaginian defeat. Scipio's campaigns in Spain demonstrated that Roman military leadership was learning from earlier defeats and developing new tactical approaches specifically designed to counter Carthaginian advantages. His victory at the Battle of Ilipa showed that Roman generals could now match Hannibal's own tactical innovations, using flexible formations and coordinated attacks to defeat experienced Carthaginian armies. The psychological warfare that had been such a crucial element of Hannibal's early successes was gradually losing its effectiveness as Roman commanders gained experience fighting Carthaginian forces. The terror that had gripped Roman armies after Trebia and Trasimene was replaced by a more pragmatic understanding of Carthaginian strengths and weaknesses. Roman soldiers learned that Carthaginian troops, despite their tactical superiority, were mortal men who could be defeated through proper preparation and execution. Hannibal's position in Italy became increasingly precarious as the war dragged on without decisive results. His army, while still formidable, was slowly being worn down by constant campaigning and the inability to secure adequate reinforcements from Carthage. The diversity that had once been a source of tactical flexibility was becoming a liability as different ethnic contingents began to lose cohesion and fighting effectiveness. The arrival of Hasdrubal Barca with a second Carthaginian army offered the prospect of reinforcing Hannibal's position and potentially achieving the decisive victory that had eluded him since Cannae. However, the Battle of the Metaurus River in 207 BCE, where Roman forces intercepted and destroyed Hasdrubal's army, eliminated this last hope for Carthaginian success in Italy. When Hasdrubal's severed head was thrown into Hannibal's camp, it symbolised not just personal loss, but the definitive end of Carthaginian strategic hopes in the Italian theatre. The final phase of the Second Punic War saw the conflict's centre of gravity shift from Italy to Africa as Scipio launched his invasion of Carthaginian home territory. This strategic reversal, which forced Carthage to recall Hannibal from Italy to defend the homeland, demonstrated how completely the strategic initiative had passed to Rome. The very tactics that Hannibal had used to threaten Rome were now being employed against Carthage itself. The Battle of Zama in 202 BCE provided a fitting conclusion to the military career of history's greatest tactical genius. Facing Scipio on the plains of North Africa, Hannibal found himself commanding an army that lacked the cavalry superiority and tactical cohesion that had made his earlier victories possible. Scipio, having studied Hannibal's methods throughout the war, employed a modified version of the double envelopment to achieve decisive victory against his former tormentor. The irony of Hannibal's defeat was that it came through the application of his own tactical innovations by an enemy who had learned from repeated defeats. Scipio's victory at Zama represented not just Roman military success, but the triumph of institutional learning over individual genius. Where Hannibal had relied on personal tactical brilliance, Rome had developed systematic approaches to warfare that could be employed by competent commanders even in the absence of exceptional talent. The peace treaty that ended the Second Punic War reduced Carthage to a client state of Rome, stripped of its navy, most of its territory, and any capacity for independent military action. The terms were deliberately harsh, designed to ensure that Carthage could never again threaten Roman supremacy in the Mediterranean. Hannibal himself was eventually forced into exile, spending his remaining years as a military advisor to various eastern kingdoms that opposed Roman expansion. The transformation of the Mediterranean world following Cannae and the Second Punic War established patterns that would dominate international relations for centuries. Rome's victory demonstrated that tactical brilliance, while important, was ultimately less decisive than strategic resources, institutional resilience, and the ability to learn from defeat. These lessons would guide Roman expansion throughout the Mediterranean and beyond, creating an empire that endured for over a millennium. The cultural impact of Cannae on Roman society extended far beyond immediate military consequences. The disaster became a defining moment in Roman national consciousness, a symbol of both vulnerability and resilience that shaped imperial ideology for generations. Roman writers and historians repeatedly returned to the battle as an example of how divine favour could be lost through hubris, but regained through perseverance and proper devotion to traditional values. The memory of Cannae also influenced Roman military reforms that created the professional legions of the imperial period. The disaster highlighted weaknesses in the citizen-soldier system that made Rome vulnerable to enemies with superior military training and experience. Subsequent reforms emphasized longer terms of service, better training, and standardized equipment that would make Roman armies less dependent on individual commanders and more capable of sustained operations in distant theatres. Educational systems throughout the Roman world incorporated lessons from Cannae into their curricula, ensuring that future generations of leaders understood both the dangers of overconfidence and the importance of institutional solidarity in times of crisis. The battle became a standard example in rhetorical training, used to illustrate principles of narrative structure, character development, and moral instruction that formed the foundation of classical education. The influence of Cannae on military thinking extended well beyond the boundaries of the Roman Empire to affect military development throughout the ancient world. Eastern kingdoms facing Roman expansion studied Hannibal's tactics as potential models for their own defensive strategies, while Roman enemies sought to replicate the psychological and tactical advantages that had made the Carthaginian generals so formidable. Medieval military writers rediscovered classical accounts of Cannae during the revival of interest in ancient texts, incorporating lessons from the battle into contemporary military manuals and strategic thinking. The concept of the double envelopment became a standard element of military education, though few commanders possessed the skill or circumstances necessary to execute such a complex manoeuvre successfully. The Renaissance witnessed renewed scholarly interest in Cannae as military theorists sought to apply classical principles to contemporary warfare. The development of gunpowder weapons and changes in army organisation created new tactical possibilities, but the fundamental principles demonstrated at Cannae, the importance of reconnaissance, terrain analysis, troop morale, and coordinated attacks, remained relevant to military professionals. Modern military historians continue to analyse Cannae as perhaps the finest example of tactical artistry in recorded history, a demonstration of how superior generalship can overcome seemingly impossible odds through careful planning and flawless execution. The battle serves as a case study in multiple military disciplines, from logistics and intelligence to leadership and battlefield psychology. Contemporary military academies around the world include Cannae in their core curricula as an example of tactical perfection that remains relevant despite changes in weapons technology and organisational structure. The principles that Hannibal employed — deception, concentration of force at decisive points, exploitation of enemy weaknesses and maintenance of tactical flexibility — continue to guide military planning in the modern era. The enduring fascination with Cannae reflects broader human interest in stories of David versus Goliath, where intelligence and determination overcome brute force and superior resources. Hannibal's achievement resonates across cultures and centuries because it demonstrates the power of individual excellence to change the course of history, even when ultimate victory remains beyond reach. Yet the complete story of Cannae also serves as a reminder that tactical brilliance alone is insufficient to achieve lasting political objectives. Hannibal's masterpiece on the battlefield could not compensate for Carthage's strategic weaknesses or overcome Rome's institutional advantages. The battle thus illustrates both the potential and the limitations of military genius in shaping historical outcomes. The dusty plains of Cannae continue to attract visitors from around the world, drawn by the site's historical significance and the enduring questions it raises about leadership, strategy, and the nature of victory itself. Standing on the ground where one of history's greatest battles was fought, modern observers can appreciate both the scale of Hannibal's achievement and the broader historical forces that ultimately determined the conflict's outcome. The silence of the ancient battlefield speaks eloquently of human ambition, sacrifice, and the eternal struggle between individual brilliance and collective endurance that defines the human experience across all ages and civilizations,